Hello, hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, Hearthstone is the game, and Archthief Rafaam is the card. This powerful new legendary from League of Explorers is certainly making waves thanks to its incredibly powerful Battlecry effect. Anytime you play Archthief Rafaam, you get to discover one of 3 insanely powerful cards. These are all 10 mana spells that have huge impacts on the game. Up first is Lantern of Power, which allows you to give a minion +10/+10. Mirror of Doom will summon 7 3/3 minions onto your side of the board. And Timepiece of Horror will do 10 damage, randomly split across enemies that you might be facing. So, now that you've seen how powerful these cards are and how insane the stats are in Archthief Rafaam, you probably want to experiment with this card and play him in some kind of crazy late game control deck, and I certainly can't blame you. The problem is, once he actually hits the board and you have to make a really tough decision between these 3 cards, the question remains, which one do I pick? And that's why I'm making this video. This is a guide to help you sort through all 3 of these artifacts to determine which one is going to be the best one for you in any given moment in any given game. Now that said, I don't know what kind of deck you're playing Archthief Rafaam in, so I can't give you specific tips based on your deck list or crazy combos you have imagined or card cost reductions or something insane that's going on in your specific list. But I do want to help you think about how all 3 of these cards interact with the board state and things they allow you to do, or maybe situations you wouldn't want to take a risk. So I just want to take a deep dive into all 3 of these cards and discuss how they are typically going to operate when you select them from Archthief Rafaam's Discover effect. So up first is Lantern of Power. Of course, this is your buff that will give a minion +10/+10. Now, we've never seen a buff card that strong, and this one has all kinds of crazy potential. It is the strongest, I would argue, of all 3 of the cards, just because it can have such an immediate impact and gives you so much value in stats. So it's very much a high-risk card, but also a very high-reward card. And as you'll see, all 3 of these cards can kind of be discussed along that angle, how risky they are and how rewarding they are. Choosing Lantern of Power is a big commitment, but man, if it works, the payoff is going to be huge. Just imagine if Archthief Rafaam himself survives. He's a 7/8. If you get to buff him 10/10 the following turn, you've got a 17 attack minion on the board. If that gets to attack the enemy's face, I don't see how you can lose very many games in that scenario. So certainly Lantern of Power has the opportunity to straight up win games if you get to play it. But there are some things to consider, right? First off, for Lantern of Power to ever work, you have to have a minion on the board. So you're playing Archthief Rafaam as a 7/8 for 9 mana. That probably means that your opponent already had a minion or 2 on board, and it means they're going to have 9 or 10 mana to respond to Archthief Rafaam. So there's a good chance they can find a way to kill him, whether that's trading a couple minions in, whether that's finding a removal spell, whether that's a big game hunter. It's not likely that Archthief Rafaam will survive to the point that you can play this spell on him the following turn. So the question is, are you going to have a minion on the board at not only next turn, but at any given point in the game from there on where you can actually afford to keep a 10 mana spell in hand and eventually get to use it? In other words, you could play 2 minions next turn, hoping that one of them survives for your Lantern of Power buff, but the opponent could clear them again. You could just be an endless cycle before eventually you're out of cards and all you've got left is a Lantern of Power that is totally unusable. Since it costs 10 mana, you can't feasibly use it with a charge minion, unless perhaps there's some crazy cost reduction stuff going on. So 99% of the time, you need to know that you'll have a minion on board. So if your deck has really sticky Death Rattle minions, if you've got 2 Haunted Creepers and a Piloted Shredder and a Sledge Belcher out when you play Archthief Rafaam, there's a good chance at least something will survive for the buff. Otherwise, this card might just be too risky. You may never actually get to cast the spell and use that 10 damage. Some other things to consider are whether or not the enemy has any taunts remaining in their deck. You'll typically know based on the kind of deck and how far along you are in the game and what you've already seen, how likely it is that they're going to have another taunt in hand. So not only is there another taunt in their deck, but how many cards are in their hand and how likely is it that one of those is a taunt? Because even the tiniest taunt, even a Gold Shower Footman, can deny your 17 attack Archthief Rafaam from attacking if it's in the way. Because you can't combo this with a removal spell. You can't combo it with a silence. All that would cost 12 mana. Perhaps in Druid you could pull out some crazy stuff thanks to Innervate. But typically, 99% of the time, a taunt will also deny Lantern of Power. The last thing you want is a 1 or even a 0 mana target dummy denying your huge 10 damage spell. So think about taunts. Also consider, is your opponent even within lethal range anyway? So in other words, is picking Lantern of Power, using it on a minion, and attacking their face, which is the ideal scenario, that's the dream, would that kill him in the first place? If it's not going to do enough damage to kill them, if it's just going to give you a really meaty minion on the board, it might not be worth it. So they're not in lethal range in the first place. I'd almost never pick Lantern of Power because I don't think it would ever pay off. And then finally, you have to think about whether or not any silences have been used. So hopefully they're in lethal range, and that's the only time you'd play it is when Lantern of Power kills them. But sometimes you might want to pick Lantern of Power just as a buff to give you a really strong minion on the board that might have a chance at surviving a turn or two. In that case, consider whether they've used their silences. If they still have a pair of silences, if you know they've been sitting on that Ironbeak Owl for 5 turns, you're not going to be able to stick a 10-10 buff, right? That's the first thing that's going to come out. So, don't use this thing if you're expecting a silence and if that would actually matter. In other words, you're trying to keep the minion on the board. Don't ever pick it unless they're in lethal range anyway, because typically a 12-12 minion or something crazy isn't going to be that powerful all on its own. Don't pick it if you think it could be denied by a taunt. And make sure that you have a really good chance of keeping a minion on the board. If not next turn, then at least in the next few turns. So that you're not wasting a ton of mana and a lot of tempo just on the hope to get off a Lantern of Power. So the real goals with this card are to kill your opponent quickly, essentially using that 10-10 as a charge that is played on a minion that already has an opportunity to attack. And just squeezing out 10 damage right into the enemy face. So that's Lantern of Power. Up next, let's take a look at Mirror of Doom. This one, of course, fills your board with 3/3 mummy zombies, which is the coolest thing ever, by the way, mummy zombies. That's amazing. That needs to be a movie. So for Mirror of Doom, I would classify this card as moderate risk and moderate reward. In other words, it's not as risky as a Lantern of Power, simply because no matter what is going on in the game, if you play it, you're at least going to get a few minions, right? Something can happen. This card is playable on any given turn. Unlike Lantern of Power, which sometimes you may not be able to play it at all because there's no minion on the board. With Mirror of Doom, you can always cast it. Something's going to happen. You might only get 1 3/3 if you've already got 6 minions. Your opponent might have a Flame Strike waiting and totally ruin your board, but you're going to get value. It's guaranteed to do at least something, and that's what makes it the moderate reward. There are some downsides. There is some risk. It could be easily removed. It might be too slow, all that stuff, but something's going to happen. It's moderate risk, moderate reward. So what do you consider when picking Mirror of Doom? So, similar to last time, first question is, will you have any minions alive? In other words, every minion you have on the board reduces the potential value of Mirror of Doom. If you've got 6 Silverhand recruits on the board, you're going to cast a 10 mana spell that summons 1 3/3 minion, which might just be the worst play in Hearthstone history. Be awful. Super low value play. So you'd never want to pick Mirror of Doom in a situation where you're expecting to have a lot of minions on the board. Now that said, typically it's hard to predict what's going to be happening into the following turn whenever you pick Mirror of Doom. They might have a board clear that removes 5 minions, but if you have a lot of sticky death rattle stuff, you got 3 or 4 minions out there, your deck is designed around that, then Mirror of Doom might not be best for you just because you're reducing the value that's inherent to the card, the more stuff that's already on the board. So the next thing to consider for Mirror of Doom is that it's really, really slow. So with Lantern of Power, it's actually a quick card. It has an immediate impact. That 10 damage is instantly valuable as long as the minion is ready to attack. But with Mirror of Doom, it's actually kind of a 3-turn play. You play Archthief Rafaam on the first turn. On the second turn, you summon your zombies. And then on the third turn, you finally get to do something with your zombies. So in reality, this is an incredibly slow and low-tempo play. You're giving your opponent a lot of time to do things, a lot of time to prepare. In other words, they know that Mirror of Doom might be what you picked, and they can set up ways to trade or save a board clear. They can play around it. And you're just giving them time to hit you, right? Against an aggressive deck, this would just be way too slow to ever actually accomplish anything. So it does take some time for Mirror of Doom to work. That's another reason it's a moderate reward. Yeah, if they do all survive, you've got 21 damage right on the board lined up ready to go. Or you can do a lot of trading or just kill the enemy. But it takes a while for that to happen, and it's very likely that something could go wrong in the meantime. And one of those things, of course, that could go wrong is the next thing on our list, and that is a board clear. What is the likelihood that your opponent will just be able to easily dispose of all these minions? You're playing a mage that typically runs Flame Strike in their list. Mirror of Doom is probably inadvisable unless you've already seen both Flame Strikes. You're running a priest who might have Light Bomb. Guess what? They're wiping out your Mirror of Doom for a 4 mana advantage. They only paid 6 to deny you 10. Even a priest with a Velen's Chosen and a Holy Nova Rite could clear your board. So there are a lot of different ways for this play to be punished extremely hard from various decks. Even a Brawl from a Warrior is going to wipe out most of the value that you'd get from Mirror of Doom. So only if it's really, really late in the game and you've already exhausted all their area of effect spells. That's about the only time I'd pick Mirror of Doom against a class with any kind of board clear potential. Otherwise, if you waste 10 mana and they can clear it with a Hellfire for 4 mana, you've just given up so much potential value that you could have gotten from another artifact card, so much tempo for all the mana. You spend an entire turn to accomplish nothing. It's just far too risky. And that's where the moderate risk instead of the low risk part of this card comes into play. So another thing to consider, if you're a class that can combo off of multiple minions on the board, namely something like Druid with a Savage Roar in hand, it might be worth taking the risk to play Mirror of Doom. If they don't have a board clear and you stick 3 of these guys on the board, that's going to be, 17 damage. That's a 17 damage combo next turn with your Savage Roar. Not to mention whatever else you have in hand. So it might be a way to get lethal. Not everybody can deal with a bunch of 3/3 minions all that easily, particularly another Druid, for instance. So if you do have the combo potential, even if it's combo potential with something like a Cold Blood for Rogue that just needs 1 minion to stay on the board, or a Tinkers, right? Or if it's just a Defender of Argus. If you've got a Defender of Argus in hand and you'd like to guarantee that you have a minion or 2 on board to use it with next turn, maybe you just really need to taunt up. That's a possibility. Keep that in mind. And then the final thing to consider for Mirror of Doom is really, are you dead? So in other words, can the opponent kill you by the time that third turn comes around and you can actually accomplish something with your mummy zombie horde? If you are dead, if they've got like lethal on board, of course, that won't matter what artifact you pick probably. If you think they have the potential to kill you in 2 turns while you're setting up your Mirror of Doom, there might be a better alternative than Mirror of Doom. It's a little too slow. Lantern of Power might just be too hard to pull off in that scenario. So if you think you're dead and you absolutely have to answer your opponent's board, there's one third artifact that might be right for you, and that is Timepiece of Horror. This allows you to do 10 damage randomly split among all enemies. It is a super arcane missiles, but a particularly bad one, right? That's 3 damage for 1 mana. This is 10 damage for 10. So really, I would say Timepiece of Horror is the worst of all the artifacts when it comes to pure value standpoint. It's really quite overcosted for what it is. You would see Avenging Wrath and a Paladin doing 8 damage for 6 mana, for instance. So feels quite punishing to play Timepiece of Horror in comparison. So that's why this card gets the low reward designation. It really probably isn't going to swing a game in your favor. It's not a big comeback mechanic necessarily. It's a little slow for what it accomplishes. But on the other side of that coin, it's a very low risk card. You can't really be punished for picking Timepiece of Horror. You can be punished for trying to play Mirror of Doom. You can be punished for playing or even holding and sitting on Lantern of Power for the rest of the game. Timepiece of Horror has a very low chance of punishing you. You're going to guaranteed get the value you expect from this card. You may never get value from Lantern of Power. Your value might be dissipated very quickly if you play Mirror of Doom, but you're going to get the 10 damage from Timepiece of Horror, unless, of course, you get counterspelled or something, but that's a whole other story, and that would be the same for all 3 artifacts. So it's very low risk. It's going to happen. The 10 damage will come through. But it's also unlikely that 10 damage actually accomplishes anything too significant. Although there are certainly scenarios where it can just win you the game, and that's why this card exists, and that's why it's still worthwhile to consider. So what do we consider with Timepiece of Horror? Really, it's that immediate but minor impact. So it's going to do something quickly. It's going to give you 10 damage no matter what. But how effective that 10 damage really is going to be just depends on the board state, the enemy's health total, your own board. There's a lot of different things to consider. So the first thing is, will it be lethal if you play a Timepiece of Horror? In other words, if they have 2 health, and you're absolutely just digging for an instant impact card that can give you 2 damage, Timepiece of Horror might be it. They might have 4 or 5 minions out on the board, but you're still very likely to do that final 2 damage, right? Even if they play something like a Sledge Belcher that denies the rest of your minions, and they've got 5 health, well, guess what? This might just be lethal, right? It might kill your Sledge Belcher and then also kill their face. So it's hard to gauge exactly what it's going to look like next turn after you've played your Archthief and you're getting ready to play your artifact. You never quite know what the enemy's health total will be. They could play an Antique Healbot in between and ruin your plans. But if you're in a good spot in the game, if you're ahead, if you've got some board, they have trouble clearing your last few minions, Timepiece of Horror might just be the best card to pick, because eventually, if you save it for later, as we see on one of these notes, it could win you the game down the road. It doesn't have to be played right away. So this is kind of the win more card as opposed to the comeback mechanic that the other 2 cards probably emphasize. This one really is just a card that helps you seal the DL and finish out games. So, is it lethal? If you know you're going to get lethal out of this card, I'd certainly pick it almost every time. 99.9% of the time you're going to pick this if you expect with a good chance that it will provide lethal. You also have to consider what minions they can play. If they can play 7 or 8 minions, right, it might kill them all. If they do 2 muster for battles, you might just be able to totally wipe out their board. If they play 3 or 4 really high health minions, it probably won't accomplish much. So if you're expecting a couple Death Lords out of the opponent's deck, and right after you pick your artifact, they play 2 Death Lords, you may have just completely wasted your 10 mana spell. Suddenly you've got a couple 2/4 minions and just a couple points of damage off the enemy face. So keep that in mind. And also just consider whether it's something you can save for later. Just because you pick the artifact the turn Archthief Rafaam is played, it doesn't mean you have to play it the very next turn. This is the kind of card you can hang on to for a more important moment later on in the game and look to really squeeze as much value as possible out of it. So these other ones are riskier. If you're feeling okay with the game and you just want to have a backup or a direct damage spell for later on, Timepiece of Horror might be it. But of course, the final thing to consider with this card is really the RNG element. This is the most random of the all three artifacts. This one, you know exactly what's going to happen. You control it completely. This one is uncontrollable. It just does the same thing every turn. There's no random element. But this one has a pretty high RNG factor. So they might be at 1 to health with a Death Lord and a Silverhand Recruit and another Silverhand Recruit. And you could not get the win, right? You could, even though there's only 3 minions and they're at 1 health, you could still hit all the minions for 10 and lose the game. So you have to count on, you don't know where exactly these randomly split points of damage are going to hit. You might leave 4 minions at 1 health when you were trying to clear the enemy board, right? So they might have 7 Silverhand Recruits and you hit all 10 to the face. You never quite know with Hearthstone's RNG what's going to happen. So that is really the riskiest element of this card. And if you think that RNG is going to play a big role in how valuable this card is to you, so if it is a paladin that hasn't used a couple musters and you're looking to hit their face, maybe this isn't the right answer. Maybe that RNG is just scary enough to deny this card as your choice. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Lantern of Power, Mirror of Doom, and Timepiece of Horror. It can definitely be tough picking between these 3 cards. It takes a little bit of practice and a lot of foresight. But hopefully I've helped you kind of define a little bit of a heuristic that helps you narrow down when and why each of these cards might be good and things to think about as you're making that decision. So hopefully Archthief Rafaam will be a fun card for you and a rewarding card, because I sure think he has lots of potential and I can't wait to see him in action. These artifacts are pretty insane, and it's definitely one of the most fun cards Hearthstone has had in a while. So there you have it. That's your guide to selecting Archthief Rafaam's artifacts. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.